Hey, what's up, Passage family? Welcome back to another episode of the P3D podcast. I'm your host, Clayton Welch, and with me, as always, is Michael Loin. What's up, dude?
Hey. Here we are, back at it.
We had a little hiatus.
We did. We accidentally.
We've had a couple busy months here at the church. I mean, we say that as we're going into Easter, so that's even more busy.
Easter's like that one. It's like a kind of a one-off busy. We had a lot of cool stuff, good things happening at the beginning of the year. So we were, podcast is not a primary ministry, but it's one that we do enjoy. Yeah, we'd love for it to grow. Ministry.
Yeah.
So we just do it when we have some time.
Is that a plug to say, hey, if you like this podcast, share it with your friends or subscribe or something?
That was my non-intrusive way of saying.
Ooh, and then I just intruded.
That's fine. I think it's good. It's good. We need more people to share. I mean, the way we think about the podcast is we want to talk about things that are important to us and be a repository of things that we've discussed from the perspective of this is how the Passage Church does it and thinks about it. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's it. So
the P3D, for people who haven't heard other episodes or aren't really familiar with the P3D, why we call it 3D? What are the 3Ds?
It is discover, develop, and deploy. Yep. Now we've altered those a little bit, but those are what we have finally come up. We have to tweak things. What was the deploy? Used to be something else.
Develop? That's still.
It was demonstrate. It used to be demonstrate.
That's what it was.
And then me and Matt had the same idea the same day, and he walked in as I was writing it on the board, and he was like, I was thinking about changing the third D. I was like, to what? Yeah. And he was like, deploy. I was like, bro, same.
I know. And you guys had the meme where the electricity is going between their brains.
That was it, man. That was it. And I'd been here for 3 months, so it felt like yeah, we're cool.
Yeah, and that's when we knew that you were a keeper.
Yeah.
Until then, it was like...
I thought it was when I showed up to that cookout wearing the American flag tank top and a cowboy hat.
I had pulled Matt aside, and I was like, I don't know about this guy. I'm just kidding. I didn't know.
That's valid, though. I mean, I feel like you should be skeptical of people. I'm skeptical of people.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not skeptical of this podcast or this topic that we're talking about today. Right. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, the inspiration is twofold. So a little plug here. We do a thing called Equip. So it's like classes that we run throughout the year. We usually try and do 3 or 4.
Yep.
And I'm doing one right now on apologetics, which we call Defending Your Faith, which is not a unique title. I think R.C. Sproul has a book titled by that. Pretty much everybody else does.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot out there.
But we've been doing apologetics, and then we just talked about the resurrection this past week, and I thought it would be cool to tie in on the podcast, just kind of go over some of that stuff because we have Easter coming up.
Yeah.
And just I think the resurrection, so first of all, again, in line with what we think about the podcast, we want to talk about important things that are important to us. And that we want to have just out there that we can share with people in a relatable fashion. I just thought it would be cool to go through it and just kind of put it out there. And then also just to plug these Equip classes. Like I teach some, Pastor Kirk has taught some in the past. Matt teaches them. I'm going to have someone co-teach with me this next semester coming up. So it's a great way to get plugged in. You get to meet people. You get to be in an engaging environment. It's not monologuing. It's not
right. You're not just coming to listen. It's more of like a open forum classroom type.
Yeah.
Well, not open forum, but
I mean, it really is. I mean, that's the way I like to run it. Is you can raise your hand at any point. I mean, I'm like, yeah, you can even interrupt me. It's not a formal setting at all.
What do you mean by interrupt?
Like that?
What do you mean?
Just what do you mean? Yeah. I'm talking. And you're like, hang on a minute. Wait a second.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but yeah.
So the resurrection. Yeah, it's a pretty big deal in the Christian faith. I mean, it is the deal, right?
Yeah, and it's a big deal for a couple of reasons, right? I think it's a big deal because it's one of those markers, something that Christianity lost, well, a little bit we've lost. I mean, we didn't have to, but as it has transferred from culture to culture to culture, it takes on, different, cultural meaning in the holidays that it picks up and the way it's celebrated, right? So when Christianity came out of Judaism, the first and second and third century Jews, they kept celebrating a lot of like the Old Testament holidays and feasts and things like that. But as it's made its way over here to America, like we don't, like it's with such a melting pot over here, like we don't really have a lot of like, you know, like a feast or a holiday, you know, like Chinese New Year.
How do you feel
know.
about that?
I mean, I think it's a loss.
Yeah.
I do. I think that's one of the reasons that like other cultures do really well is like rites of passage. And we've talked about this like as dads a lot, that like there's an important part of like having a little bit of pageantry to the rites of passage that young men and young women go through, and to make much of those things. But when you don't really have a culture to cling on to, specifically like, I mean, I hope this comes across the right way, but like just kind of vanilla, like white bread, just regular old American people, you know.
Yep. Cheese pizza.
You know, that's what we got. We don't have anything. So I think it's a loss. I think it's a loss that we don't have those feasts and markers.
Well, it's kind of like, I mean, our culture is very much check the box and get it done.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I mean, we're like, all right, we got Easter coming up. All right, what do we got to do? Well, we got to get the egg hunt. And then we get the egg hunt. All right, egg hunt done. Check. Going to church. Check. Going out to eat. Check. All right,
Moving
Easter's
on.
done.
Great.
Those like three things are kind of the common with every family, right?
Yeah.
We're going to go to an egg hunt if you have kids.
Yep.
We're going to go to church. Then we're going to go out to eat. We better get reservations now because it's super busy.
Yeah. So Easter and Christmas, those are the big ones, right? And then we have to anything else. Like we kind of develop in, like there'll be other traditions, but it'll mostly be like, at this point, it's kind of secular and it's usually regional, right? You know, like, oh, this, you know, like this, like Lexington has the barbecue festival or whatever, you know, or like they have a competition a couple times a year.
Yes.
Or like, you know, Louisiana has Mardi Gras, you know, like that's a part of the culture there. You know, so things like that, like those are regional.
It is.
But, right.
As a Louisiana native, I can say yes.
That's true. So
I confirmed this.
Confirmed.
So I didn't actually realize all this stuff about the traditions and all that stuff until we went to an Andrew Peterson concert around Easter.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually after Easter, or after the day of the resurrection, right? That you celebrate.
Uh-huh.
It was like a couple weeks after, and I just remember him like being up there, and he was like, "Hey guys, it's Easter. We're still celebrating Easter." And I was like, "What?
Still?
Easter was like last week or
We
something."
did this.
Like,
It's
we
done.
already did this, you know. And then I was like, "Oh wait, it's a whole like time of you to just focus on that." And I thought it was super cool. It's kind of the first time that I can think of that I was conscious of there being traditions and stuff that go along with Easter.
Yeah, I love traditions. I think my childhood, and so we'll bring it back here to the resurrection in a second. Like my childhood was a little bit chaotic because of just like, you know, like broken family, like divorce, things like that. Like I was different places all different times of the year, staying with different family, and so like I didn't have a lot of the same thing happening the same way. And so as I got out on my own, like doing the same things at the same time, like having a tradition is just super special to me. And I like to, and I think we've tried to incorporate, and the same thing for my wife, and we're trying to bring that into our family. But I think that's one, like Easter is one of those things, because we have so few markers in the Western American church that where we can, like, where culturally we kind of think about things the same way. Easter is really important for that, and that's like a really small reason, but it is an important reason.
Do you think it's like a Baptist thing? Do you think or the type of denominations celebrate things differently? Like,
no, I mean, like the Catholic Church does a way better job celebrating different holidays throughout the year.
That's what I'm saying. Like,
but like the church that I kind of had experience with growing up was a Lutheran church. They do like holidays and traditions and like, you know, different celebrations and festivals. Like the liturgical churches do a really good job of that.
Yes, liturgy and stuff like that.
So the Baptists we actually do the worst job of it because we're just out here kind of like not doing any of it. So
man, I feel like we could go on. Let's bring it back. We could go down a long rabbit hole with that.
So Easter is important, but that means the resurrection is important because it's attached to like Easter, like this holiday. So we mark it. We mark it on the calendar.
Yes.
But why do we mark it on the calendar? Is because we have this really important. It's not just like a theological truth, but it's a theological truth that's linked to an event, right? So Christmas is the incarnation, right? So like God becomes a man, And the resurrection is Jesus proves that he's God. And so like those are the two big ones that we do. In 1 Corinthians 15, if you read through the whole chapter, it's Paul going through the like the theological significance, the spiritual significance of the resurrection. And basically the kind of the catch-all verse in there, I think it's like right around 12 or 13, is that if Christ is not raised, then there is no faith. And if Christ is not raised, then we are to be pitied above all men, right? So there's this idea that if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, then nothing else that Jesus did matters, because it proves that he's not the guy.
Yeah.
Like it could be anybody. So yeah, that's kind of, I think that's why Easter is really important. We need to talk about it because we need to understand it. And that's why we talked about it in the apologetics class, because you need to be able to defend it. Like, how do we know Jesus was raised from the dead? Because it's an important doctrine, but most of us we kind of accept it. But if anyone were to question it, like what would you tell them?
Right. Yeah.
So like that's kind of my question to our class, and we kind of talk about this is, what do we do with miracles? Like, are miracles something that you can only believe by faith? What do you think?
Are miracles something that you can only believe by? No, because if there's documentation of the miracle, right? So like with the resurrection, right? There's a ton of there's a lot of things about the resurrection. Like if you go through that book, The Case for Christ, like
Lee Strobel,
there's a ton of things that he points out that are just like, oh yeah, that wouldn't make sense. Like,
that's right.
If you're having somebody tell about the resurrection, why would you use women to tell that story in that time period where no one listened to women? Like, you'd be like, well, I want to get somebody of influence to tell the story. It's like just things like that. You're like, what? Yeah,
it tends you to think.
Also, I mean, like, go ask any of these 500 people.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, it's just very. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of evidence for it.
Yeah, there is a lot of evidence for it. And so that's one of the things that like I think is important for Christians to be able to do, is not just to say, well, how do you know Jesus is the one? Because like one thing that we talked about in the apologetics class is Christian particularism, which is just this idea that Jesus is exclusively the way to get to heaven, right? He's the only one who can reconcile us to God.
And then people say, how do you know?
Right. And you ask, how do you know? Well, and then that's linked directly to, well, look at how the New Testament presents Jesus. Look at how the Gospels present Jesus. There's these 4 really solid accounts, historical accounts of his life. Yeah. And then like, but okay, great. He did all that stuff, but how do you know? Well, he also kind of, features in the story is that he raised himself from the dead. Yeah. And that like, if you could verifiably prove that someone had the power to raise themselves from the dead, like what does that do? What does that do to their testimony? What does that do to the things that they've said and done? Like, it gives them so much credibility. Yeah. So that's why we need to be able to defend not just that Jesus is the way, right? I can point to you all the ways that Jesus made that claim, right? But what's the thing? What is the one undeniable thing that if we can prove it, shows that Jesus is not crazy, and that he's not a fraud, but that he really is who he says he is.
Yeah. So and that's really, for me, like if there's ever a time, like if somebody has a question about something and I don't know the answer, and like there's not really a concrete, the Bible says this, right? So, and we can debate this, but like the origin story, right? Like how old is the earth and things like that, and how come, when was this, and how many days, and this, and be like, dude, I don't know. I do know that Jesus was alive. He died, and now he's alive again.
Yeah, and like, there's even a point, because you talk about being able to quote scripture, and like I think that's important. But scripture, while authoritative simply because it's God's word, like it can have very little effect on a skeptic, right? Someone who, just because by virtue of knowing that you're talking about the Bible, is going to be disinclined to believe it simply because they know it's the Bible. Right, because they're biased against it. Yeah. So what are the ways? And this is kind
of like you're proving your point with your point. What's that? Is that circular reasoning? What is that when you a circular definition?
Yeah. Like a circular definition would be like you're saying something that really, like when you walk the logic out, it just ends up back where you started.
How do you know the Bible's true? Well, the Bible says it's true.
Right.
Like that kind of
I
stuff.
mean,
Right.
and that technically is circular reasoning.
Yeah.
Now, if the Bible is just another book, then it's circular reasoning. But if it's written by God, then it's not circular reasoning, because if God says it, then it is authoritative.
Yeah, Pastor Kirk did a good podcast, P3D podcast. Go back and listen to that one. It's after this one. It's on the Bible, so it's pretty good.
So what we did in the class, what we did most recently, talking about the resurrection, is we talked about something, and I think this is not a new thing. It's been around for a while. I know William Lane Craig, Lee Strobel, Habermas. I can't remember his first name. It's like Richard or something like that.
I thought his first name was Haber and his last name was Mass.
Habermas.
I don't know him.
I don't know that guy.
No.
Yeah, there's several scholars who kind of have used this before, but it's called the minimal facts approach. Have you heard of that before?
Nope. Lay it on me.
All right. So the minimal facts approach, this is the kind of way I describe it to the class. And this is, you can use this for a lot of things in Scripture, but specifically this works really well for the resurrection, because the resurrection is so important. We need to be able to defend it. You can imagine that there's the picture of, like, if the truth, like if the truth of the gospel, the truth of Jesus' life was a puzzle, and there was a piece missing, right? And I'm saying that the most important piece here that's missing is the resurrection, right? So I'm trying to use this puzzle. I'm putting this puzzle together for a skeptic. And there's this part here that's kind of the key piece. It goes right in the middle, so you can see all of the truth. There's this puzzle piece missing, and I'm saying it's the resurrection. And they're like, well, no, it's not. Like, Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. So I can't, like, because I wasn't there, because I can't take them there, right? And because the evidence that I point to is at a distance from us, like time-wise, geographically speaking, I can't make someone accept that the missing piece in the story of understanding who Jesus is the resurrection. But what I can do is I can fill in all the space outside of that missing piece, and then I can make a truth claim as to the thing that best fits in that spot. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So yes. It's like if I were to draw the outline of a human on a whiteboard and say, like, what fits in that space, right? I didn't draw a human, just the outline of a human.
Yeah.
And someone else could say, well, I think like a dog could fit in there. Well, maybe it could potentially fit in there, or something else, like a scarecrow could fit in there.
A scarecrow.
But like what I'm saying is, like, no, what fits best in that spot is human. And so that's the case that the minimal facts approach takes for a skeptic to say, like, basically, here's all the things that scholars on both sides of this argument, archaeologists, like people who know their stuff, here's all the things that we can agree on historically, biblically, textual criticism wise. Here's all the things that we know are true, right? All the things that we know are true. And then with those details, we're going to draw an outline, and I'm going to make the truth claim to say resurrection is what answers the question, how do we have all this? Like, what is the answer to these questions, essentially? So there's really four of them. The first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Universally accepted.
Universally.
All right?
Yep.
Because no one's going to argue with, well, I guess the first one would be that Jesus is a real person, but that one's so...
Which a lot of people, it's universally accepted.
Yes. Like, no one who's seriously looked at this at all is going to say, like, well, I don't even know if Jesus was real.
Right.
Okay, clearly Jesus was real. Like, the impact, like, it's a real person.
Yeah, BC.
Right. AD. It's a big one, right? So Jesus is a real person. So that's a foundation, right? Which means he was obviously born, and we can talk about, the claims, virgin birth, whatever. So if he's a real person, that means he came into existence at some point. So we have Jesus who exists. We have this other undeniable fact that this influential person, Jesus, right? And this is from a skeptic's perspective, not a biblical perspective. This influential person, Jesus, was killed by crucifixion. Okay. And that's an important detail because it establishes what we need is, in order to establish the resurrection, we need to get from alive. And then to...
And we're all on the same page with that.
Right. Everybody, he's alive. Yep. And then at some point he has to be dead. Right. And then for resurrection...
Then things change.
Right. Well, and then at some point for resurrection to be true, we have to have evidence of him being alive again, right? So we have to, basically, we just need to, historically speaking, do the best job we can to establish Jesus lived, Jesus died, like as all humans have ever died, as dead as anyone has ever died, and then he's back alive again, right? So that's what we're trying to establish. And so the death on the cross is really important because it gets us that first win, which is like, okay, we know Jesus existed, and we know that he was killed in the way that the Gospels present him being killed, right? And there's lots of extra biblical evidence of this. There's like Roman historians who talk about it, you know, and they're not obviously eyewitnesses, but they are, but they're credible enough, right? So they're repeating what is known early on in the history of the church, right? And so like there's some competing schools of thought out there that would push back against this first point that Jesus died, was killed by crucifixion. The first one would be, there's this old dead German dude, Schleiermacher, who floated this idea. It's called the swoon theory. Have you ever heard of this?
Nope.
What do you think of when I say swoon?
Swoon, like I don't know why I'm going romantic.
Yeah, I think that I thought that too the first time I heard this. But like swooning is actually a like it's a larger definition, but it's
a big weird bird.
Yeah, it's a swoon.
A swoon. Yeah,
it's way bigger than a swan. No, it's this idea that that like you just faint. So that Jesus didn't actually die, but he just appeared to have died, and the Romans got confused. And then...
Oh, they were confused after they stabbed him in the side.
Right, yeah. They were confused after the guys who professionally kill people on crosses didn't do their job good this one time. Right. Like, I don't think there's a historical... There's probably not a book for this, but I've never come across, like, lots of evidence of people surviving crucifixion. So, like, it's a weird theory, and, you know, like, he has his reasons for floating it out there. But, like, there's obviously, let's say it's even possible that everyone botched their job that day, that they were in a rush, they pulled him down off the cross.
Roman soldiers, the most elite army.
Right. And let's say they bury this dude, and then somehow, because they didn't do their job good, he's nursed back to health. All right. So even if
with guards at the door.
Right. And there's so many questions here. But, like, if Jesus had just survived and then he came back, how does the resurrection story get floated if it's clear that he didn't raise himself from the dead, but he just survived, right? Because what's he going to look like?
Right.
Like, he's going to look like a dude.
He'll be a little tattered and torn.
Yeah, he got the snot beat out of him and then got some holes poked in him, right?
Somebody put the jits on him.
Right, somebody did. And because the early church, because the disciples are not necessarily anticipating or understanding what resurrection would be, the fact that they would jump there doesn't make much sense. And then how do we explain, again, the ascension story? Where does Jesus go after this? Does he just sail out of here? You know, so there's some theories that, like, Jesus faked his death. You know, like there was this one guy, Hugh, it's like Schoenfield or something. I read his some stuff like months back, and he has this theory that, I mean, he was serious that, like, Jesus took some sort of like Romeo Juliet potion that made him appear dead when he wasn't, which is a weird one, man. Right? You know, because I think, like, you have to be able to prove that first, like, what did he use?
Yeah.
How would he have administered it to himself?
Is that a normal thing that people did during that time?
Right. Is that a thing that had ever happened before? How would he do it? And would he have access to those types of medicines or plants or herbs or whatever would do that? I don't know. It's so wild. It's just, it doesn't pass the logic test. So, and then the last one is kind of like Islam. They have the idea that Simon of Cyrene actually swapped places with Jesus. So Jesus wasn't actually killed, which leaves room for the fact that he was flogged. So that would have been obvious, right? So he would have been...
You know who was in front of you right there.
Yeah. And
now, if he was beaten, if that person was beaten, you couldn't recognize them, maybe that's where they're going.
But then the fact that Simon of Cyrene shows up, a guy who was supposed to have been flogged, like, again, it's putting a lot of dice in the, like, the most professional army up to this point in the world has ever seen.
Yeah. Somehow
botched all of this. All of the Jews that were watching it, who had watched Jesus for a number of years, who knew what he looked like.
Their, like, sole purpose right then was to make sure he was going down.
Like, how do you pull that off, you know? And then who's motivated to pull that off, and who would even, like, again, what do you do with, like, do you have to hide Jesus, and then he has to he has to come back, but it has to be convincing. And then whose body did they put in the tomb? Where does that body go? Right. So there's all these, what you end up doing in floating this, trying to argue against this idea. And this is why it's minimal facts, right? So the minimal fact that Jesus died by crucifixion, in order to get around that, you have to do some real historical, mental, logical gymnastics that end up being honestly more ridiculous than just believing in the resurrection. So anyways, the first point being, the first minimal fact, that Jesus was killed by crucifixion. The second one is that he was buried in a known tomb. All right. So we have death by crucifixion. Second one is he's buried in a known tomb. So do you remember whose tomb he was buried in?
What's his name?
You got it. It's right there. I can see it on your face. I can see it on your face.
Oh my gosh.
So it's Joseph. Of Arimathea, yes. Right? So a wealthy guy had a tomb. It was a brand new tomb, never been used, right? There weren't other bodies in there. These are all important facts, right? Because we're not going to confuse Jesus with some other dead body, right? The person that they name was someone who's high up, potentially like in the Sanhedrin or at least Jewish leadership. So his name appearing alongside Jesus's in a positive sense doesn't look good. So there's nothing to gain, only things to lose there. You can go and ask this person, like, because as Mark is writing this and as Paul is writing it, and the story is circulating in the months and years following Jesus' ascension, like, these are facts you could double check on. And there's so many people who are motivated to make sure the story doesn't come out, to try and discredit it, that these are questions that you would naturally ask, right? Okay, well, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Because and they're like, well, you can go ask Joseph of Arimathea, like, well, he was the one who, and they could be like, well, okay, and then you could go do that. And Joseph or one of his kids would be like, nope, that's exactly what we did. We gave him the tomb, and that's where the tomb is, and there's nobody there.
Right. I heard Tim Keller talking about it one time. So like, how many people like Jesus appeared to, right? Was like, what was the number? It was. Oh, it's like
hundreds. Right? It's well, there's at least there. Well, Paul lists in 1 Corinthians 15. He lists several examples, and one of them is that he appeared to 500 people at once.
Yeah.
But then he appeared to the disciples multiple times, all of them, and then partially, and then he appeared to Mary and Peter and John. And
yeah, so like the example Tim Keller was saying, it's like and you can think about it for you, right? So how long ago was it since you've been in college? Well, for me, let's just say 20 years, right?
Yeah.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I may not remember every detail about what happened in my college 20 years ago, but if someone came up to me and said something major, like this happened when you were there, I'd be like, I don't remember that. Or yes, I definitely remember that.
Right.
That's how, like, those witnesses, even if it's not like they didn't write it down that day. I mean, you can go ask those people.
Yeah.
Like,
and read the Gospels. It's not exhaustive detail, right?
Right.
They're not telling you what meal they had on what day, right?
Exactly.
They're not even making specific, like, daily, like, at this day of this month. Sometimes they do when it's very memorable, like when there's a holiday around it, right? There's a Passover or a Feast of Booths or something. But it's very general information that reflects that truth, that, like, they're telling you the things that were hard to forget.
Yeah,
right.
They're not going to forget. They're not going to miss that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So this idea that Jesus is buried in a known tomb is one of those details that stands out, right? And it makes the possibility of the story being a lie being propagated in the early years of the church very, very, very unlikely, because there's so many people, Romans and Jews alike, who want to discredit the story, but then there's the facts surrounding it. Like, if they wanted to use like alternative facts, to quote a former president, they could have, right? and they didn't. So there's this idea, like, did the disciples lie about the empty tomb? Like, it's really unlikely, almost impossible for them to have lied about it, because there's so many, because of the detail, like that they name the place and the person, right? And the fact that you're relying on people who have a simple task to perform that they're good at, to do it poorly, right? So that's the second minimal fact. Third minimal fact is the empty tomb, right? So that's a big one, right? So we know We know Jesus was killed on a cross. We know where he was buried, who buried him, right? The third one is that there was an empty tomb. All right, and I'm not telling you how the tomb ended up being empty. Like, this is for the skeptic. I'm not making a claim of how. I'm not making a claim of why. But historically speaking, I'm telling you that there was an empty tomb, okay? So we at least have to explain what happened to that empty tomb. So this is us making the outline of the resurrection and then trying to draw a logical conclusion of what fits in the middle.
Right.
So
we know what tomb it was.
Right.
Like, we know.
So that we can go back to it.
Yes.
And verify, hey, there's nothing there, right?
Right.
We can see the grave clothes. We can see the stone rolled away, right? We can ask the guards who were standing there, hey, is this the tomb you were standing by? They're like, yeah, right?
Yeah.
So then you have to you look at other facts like the name and location, the place of the tomb, and then the fact that the tomb is empty is recorded in all 4 Gospels, right? There's no disagreement in the 4 primary witnesses, and then in the early church, the history that's reported to us through the book of Acts and through Paul and Peter's letters, like the things that they say, like they were very early on convinced that the tomb was empty, right? And then you have like 1 Corinthians is a really cool letter because it was actually probably being written down before Mark was finished with his gospel. So the earliest testimony that we have that the early church believed that the tomb was empty, right? They're not making it up, but like as a whole, a part of the early church doctrine was that the tomb was empty. 1 Corinthians 15 is being written down before the Gospel of Mark is even being finished. And there's Paul talking about Jesus, like he's quoting it just like it's a creed. He says, that according to the scriptures, Jesus died, was buried according to the scriptures, and that he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Like, so there it is. Like the tomb was empty. So yeah, and then we talked about this, the stories being very basic in the Gospels, like that they're just reporting the facts to you. It's not mythological. It's not fictional. It's not like legendary. It's just, they're just reporting the facts to you. And then you already mentioned the other one, that the women who were the primary witnesses to the first people that they list as being the people who noticed it's women.
Yeah.
Right. Which would have been, credibility suicide in the first century.
Yeah. And there's so many of the other ones that they list too. Like, after that, like the early Christians, they're like, guys, we're all together in this. Let's just all stick together. Let's come up with our own story. And they're like, no, we're going to feed you to the lions. You're going to change your story then? Nope.
Nope.
Would you change your story if you were lying? Would you change
your
story?
And so that's actually one of the ones. So that's not like a minimal fact, like a part of the minimal fact approach, but in terms of other evidence that contributes to the resurrection, you have to factor that in, right? Because what possibly could have happened to motivate people to, like, if it's a lie, and someone dying for something doesn't mean it's not a lie. It just shows you that they very sincerely believed it, right? Because people die for lies. Like, that's not. So you can't prove that Christianity is true, but you can prove that someone believed it, which kicks the can back to what happened to make these people believe it. The same thing with, like, look how the disciples are behaving at the end of the Gospels, versus how they're behaving at the beginning of the book of Acts. What could have happened between those two to make them believe, to make them act the way they acted, right? I mean, it's almost a 180-degree transformation from like fearful and scared and separated to bold and collected, organized, and just, going for it, right?
Yeah, I don't care what you do to me, I'm not going to...
Right, something happened, and I'm telling you, the thing that fits in there is the claim that they're making. Like, what made them do that? It was the resurrection, right? So then, like, the last things on the empty tomb is, like, you have this evidence here that's attested inside and outside of the New Testament canon, that the earliest polemic or the earliest counter argument to the missing body of Jesus is that the disciples stole it, which tells you one thing, right? If the enemies are trying to make up a reason as to why they can't find the body, what does that tell you about the tomb?
It's empty.
It's empty, right? Yeah. So it's like, it's this so like you can trace it through what the people who are pushing, who hate Jesus and want the story to stop. Like, you can just look at their reaction to what has happened, and you can get all the way to the empty tomb, right? Which is really cool. And they don't, Like they didn't take it. They can't produce a body. They can't even go and say, oh, we buried him in a common grave. Here he is, right? And I know it doesn't, like he was, decomposed a little bit, but this is his body right here. Remember, we buried the 3 guys, and here's all 3 of them. If they knew where, like they could have done it if they had they could find his body, right? So any
yeah, that is true.
Right?
They could stop that movement real quick.
That's all they'd have to do is just produce a body. So, but the fact that they can't do that, it just makes this case.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't think
stronger.
I've ever thought of it that way before.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that one's I was today years old when I thought about it.
That's a good one. I know. I think I was reading. There's a really good apologetics book I was reading this past week with that one in it. I was like, this is so good. So, we can post a book in the show notes or something like that. But, and then early on, like the earliest preaching of the disciples just really heavily relies on the empty tomb. Like that analogy is used over and over again. So, and then the final one, the fourth, like minimal fact that we have is, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, right? So we have or at least the claim, right? And that's the story that early on is circulating amongst the early church, right? And this is prior to any gospels being written down. Like by the time Paul is writing 1 Corinthians 15, which is maybe 15 years after the resurrection,
right? That's why I was talking about like what's going on. But
even 15 years after it, he's not writing it down for the first time. He's quoting it to you in 1 Corinthians 15. It's already dogma. It's already creed that people, like when he says, and I say it to you as you have already heard. Right. So this is not new information to them. When they first heard the gospel, this church that's existed for at least 10 years already knows these things. So it's telling you from the very earliest point. And so like Bart Ehrman and other scholars who like to say that, various Jewish scholars like to say that, Jesus didn't even like the early church didn't even believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, or they didn't even believe he was the Messiah early on. That was something that was invented later. Like Bart Ehrman has a whole book, how Jesus became God, right?
Yes.
And like just this one argument undermines that the fact that the early church believed it from a very early point. It's not an invention. It's something that was universally accepted by all the people who follow Jesus. So we were talking earlier about some of the appearances, and I had I think I wrote down 11 really good ones. And then there was I wanted to check on this one from Acts 9. But like we have, he appears to Mary and the other women, right? That's Matthew and John. And he appears to Peter, who runs to the tomb after him. And then John's probably with him. We have the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus.
Right?
What?
John Windsor.
Yeah, I think John's I was a little bit faster.
That's what John
Peter.
Piper, his cousin is Peter.
Yeah,
He used to make fun of him and be like, well, John won the race. So.
That's right. So you have the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, which is in the end of Luke. And then you have, he appears to the 10 apostles in Luke. Then he appears to the 11 apostles in John. And some of these might be some overlap between the Gospels. And then he appears to the 7 apostles in John, but those are all 3 separate instances. He appears to all the apostles at the very end of Matthew, in Matthew 28. He appears to the 500 disciples at once, which Paul references in 1 Corinthians 15. Then he appears to James separately, which is actually what causes James to be converted. Because remember, James is not a follower until after the resurrection, which is cool because he's the one who writes the book of James. And then he appears again to the apostles right before his ascension, and we get that in Acts 1, Matthew 28, kind of similar instances there. There's the one in John where they're fishing and Jesus eats with them on the shore. I think that's one of the 7 apostles. And then he appears to the apostle Paul, right? And now that was the fishy one. I was I'm not sure. I couldn't remember if that was post ascension or not. But so it may have not been a physical bodily appearance, which is also an important thing to note, that all of these things are bodily appearances of Jesus, right? Like he eats, drinks with them, like they're able to touch him, like they're convinced, Mary grabs onto his feet thinking he's the gardener, it's a physical bodily thing that is not, so it's not like a vision, it's not a hallucination, it's not like a disembodied spirit. Which
is an argument, right? People think that there's that argument that they believed it so much and wanted it to be true so much that they manifested it somehow in their minds that he was there.
Yeah, and
but
then
all of them at the same time, they all had the same vision.
Yeah, right. And that's one way. How do we have such uniform belief and uniform? Because if there were differences in the visions, like those things would bear themselves out in the theology of the early church, right? It would have been easy to discern for the early church that it was a hallucination or it was a vision. And then that means that Jesus is not bodily raised from the dead. So where's the body? So we always end up, you just kick it back until you get to, because ultimately the best defense of the resurrection is a really full body defense of the reliability of the New Testament. But this is something that you can separately kind of use just for the resurrection. So, and then like another thing is like first century Jewish culture, there's really no detectable understanding that is in any of the writings that they would have had a concept of just one person being raised from the dead like this, like resurrecting themselves. They had a general idea of the resurrection, right? Because, when Jesus is visiting Martha and Mary after Lazarus has died, and he's going to raise them from the dead. He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But Martha is not quite sure. He's like, Lazarus will rise again. And she's like, well, I know, Lord, like we'll all rise at the resurrection at the end of days. And he's like, oh, you don't know what I'm getting at, girl. Yeah. And so like there's that general understanding of resurrection, but that would have been like everybody. So this idea of a one-off resurrection, and then also there's no detectable understanding of like disembodied spirits or ghosts that have like a physical presence. Like there's a couple of examples in the Old Testament of seeing visions, like Saul sees a vision of Samuel, but it's like it's a vision. It's not like right. He's seeing a ghost. Like they're like that's not a thing that they don't have a paradigm for that. So it's not something that they would just be really quick to invent or to lean on, right? So there's lots of reasons that it's just very unlikely that there's some sort of like mass hallucination. So I think again the women's accounts are heavily relied on for some of the appearances. And I think 1 Corinthians 15 is really important because no one doubts that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15. No one really doubts the date. Like it's a really well attested document that shows just very early on that there's a really strong belief that Jesus really was bodily raised from the dead. And we've talked about some like the other like the circumstantial stuff. Like I mean, think about the early church, like the transformation from the end of the Gospels to the beginning of Acts. Something has to motivate that change, and it's definitely not going to be, oh, Jesus made it. He didn't actually die. Like, that doesn't change anything, right? Then they're just back to where they were before Acts, except that Jesus turns out to be really tough. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And while you're saying that, talking about that change, really, I mean, that's the change that happens in us, right?
Yes.
We believe the gospel. It's not like, hey, if you believe in Jesus, then you will be saved. It's like, oh, this resurrection happened. This changes everything.
Yeah.
And I'm different. It's different. Like that song, the record, whatever Matt Papa's saying, if this is true, this changes everything.
Yes, that's right.
What an amazing album, song, the whole thing is super cool.
And obviously,
that's a good phrase to say. Like,
the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit factors into that too, right? Because once they receive the Holy Spirit, things change. But again, it just bears witness to the, like, historically speaking, narrative speaking, something significant has occurred. And really the only thing that makes sense that would have motivated that is an act of God, right? That he has done something special. And it's that Jesus has been raised from the dead and they've received the Holy Spirit. Because for it to be what else could it have been? And then they're telling you here what it was. And so we're just going to go to them as witnesses and say, all right. Because, I mean, that's why I believe, because someone told me, right? And then God fills in those gaps. Like, I read the scriptures, I line it up with my own experiences, and like, it just makes sense. Right. Like, it just makes sense. So, and then you have like the early worship of Jesus. Like, Jesus was very clearly, very early on, thought of as being divine. Like, how do you get to Jesus being a really good teacher, potentially being a prophet, maybe this like sort of pseudo-messianic understanding of who Jesus is? Like, how do you go from there? The dude dies, and now he's very early on in the church understood to be divine. Like, what did Jesus do to cause that thought process to happen?
There's a lot of people who claim to be prophets and teachers, and they die, but they're not.
Right. Like he would not, he's in good company there. Lots of people have died.
Right. The guy who comes back to life, that's the one.
Right. That's one. And
that's the one you follow.
So again, it's not a very far logical leap to go like something significant happened. They're saying it's resurrection. I can't think of what else would make people think, well, he was a really good teacher. He was really powerful. He could do all these miracles. Like to go like from that to this dude is the Messiah. He is the incarnate God. Like raising yourself from the dead makes sense there, right? Something significant happened. So, yeah. And then like Jews are really staunch monotheists. So they're not gonna adopt like any some sort of, pantheon of gods where there's like Yahweh and then Jesus. Like that's not happening. Like it's very clearly the Jewish community understood this dude as the Messiah, and so they took what they believed and they attached it to Jesus, and it just keeps going, right? That's why you have all this like Gentile Jew stuff that Paul and the apostles have to sort through in the beginning, because Jews are jumping on board just like the Gentiles are. God is streaming the nations back to himself, just like he promised in Isaiah 2. So it's really cool. Yeah. And then like we talked about hallucinations. We talked about, like what if it's just a giant conspiracy? I guess like if you think of a conspiracy, like what are the questions? Like if it's a conspiracy, like what are the questions you ask of yourself to kind of diagnose that?
Why do I believe this conspiracy?
Yeah.
Like, why am I in on this?
Yeah. I think like so you have to think of like what's a motive?
Yep.
And what do they gain? And did they have the means to pull it off? Right? And really none of those questions are answered in the affirmative, right? So like they don't have a motive to lie about it, because how would they even know that this resurrection bit would work? Right? Yeah. Because they know that if they lied, that it's always going to be just one moment away from being exposed. Right? And so it doesn't create the kind of change that we've been talking about. The means to pull it off, these dudes are not powerful.
Yeah, and that's a big thing to try and pull off.
Yeah.
If you couldn't
like,
do it.
Talk about the bamboozle of the millennia, you know.
And like let's go back to the apostles and think about their previous behavior.
Yeah.
They couldn't pull that off.
Right. Like nothing short of like this being actually true really, really adds up. And then like what do they have to gain? Literally nothing. They have nothing to gain. They have only things to lose by doing this. Just like everyone who in the first century Jewish world, they had nothing but like they were only going to lose.
Yeah, you're going to die.
Right. So what do you have to gain? Like there's no motivation to do it, right? It's different than like, people today will call themselves Christian just to, score the social points. That didn't exist back then. There really wasn't a format for it. It's better to be known as a Christian until hundreds and hundreds of years later when Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Like then it starts to kind of get you somewhere. So early on, like that was just not the case. So yeah. And then I remember I had one of this in my notes. I was just like, I just wrote down corpse heist ?
The corpse heist.
Just the good old fashioned corpse heist. But we've kind of talked about all that. So yeah. So those
are pretty good. Those are pretty good arguments for the resurrection.
Right. I mean, and again, it's not like we believe it by faith, but we also can believe it by reason. Like, I love the fact that we don't have to, like, William Lane Craig always says, I don't have to put my brain in one pocket and my faith in another.
Yeah, right. Well, like when Jesus is telling the people, he doesn't go up on the mount and just say, all right, just believe.
Yeah.
Just have faith. He says, like, all right, consider the lilies and the ravens. Like he talks like, hey, think about this.
Like, look.
Like, let's be, like, use your brain.
Yeah.
Think about it logically.
God says in Isaiah, come let us reason together. Right.
Yes.
Like he's a God of logic and order. I mean, you look at creation, like he likes order.
Yeah.
He likes things to work and make sense.
Yeah.
And so I don't think God's asking us. So I that's why I love apologetics so much, because I think it's really important. Because it's fun. It's fun to ask the questions, because ultimately I believe God can withstand the scrutiny, because he has for several thousand years at this point. I don't think I'm going to be the one to bring him down by
the word apologetics, for those who may not know, what's the original word?
It just means you just are really sorry about the things that you believe.
No, No, it means reasoned response.
That's
I have
right.
a reasoned response ready.
Right, yeah.
Is it apologia?
It is apologia or apologia. Yeah. That's right.
Okay, good.
So, yeah, it's having a response to be able to understand what you believe and why. So,
well, what was that, before we head out, man, what was that book that you mentioned earlier?
It's called Christian Apologetics. It's written by Doug Gruthaus, I think. It's like Groot.
Dude, is that the one with the amazing cover?
Yeah, it was a really good cover. It's Groothis or UIS.
Okay,
that's a strange last name. So It's a really good one.
Okay, cool.
He's a good writer. It's like kind of like a desk reference. It's real thick.
It's thick,
but if you're interested in
theology, size,
it's thick. Yeah. So if you were interested in just like having a resource that like, hey, I wonder like how would I explain X, to someone?
What about Y?
Yeah, Y might be in there too.
Okay,
or maybe even Z. I don't.
No Z's.
You'll have to buy it. So
Well, there you go. Well, hey man, this has been an excellent episode. Good conversation with you today.
Yeah.
If you guys have any questions about it, you can always reach out to us at Clayton@thepassagechurch.com, Michael@thepassagechurch.com, and let us know what your thoughts are on the show, or if you have any questions or topics you want us to discuss. We would be glad to do that.
Definitely. We always love interacting with stuff that people want us to talk about. So, or having you on the show.
Hey, come on in here.
You got something cool to talk about, we can squeeze you on.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, guys. Thanks so much for listening. And Michael, you got anything else?
Nope. See y'all at Easter.
Cool. Yep. We'll see you at Easter.
He's risen indeed.